Joining us now in our studio in Jerusalem is Danny Danon, former ambassador of Israel to the UN and chairman of World Likud. Shalom.
Shalom, Yoni. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. So first of all, let's relate to the latest phone call from President Joe Biden, U.S. President Joe Biden, who said to Netanyahu, I support Israel, but guys, it's time to stop. It's time to, lower down the fire and proceed towards a ceasefire. Do you think that phone call was interference that you would rather it wouldn't happen?
We respect the President of the U.S. And the strong bond between Israel and the U.S., but at the end we should take the decisions according to what is important for us. And I think that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu said after that conversation, that we will continue with the operation until we will decide it's time to cease fire.
Now we'll talk about the media war where Israel has lots of challenges, but in terms of the international arena, it does seem that the world so far is really supporting Israel. We saw the foreign ministers come today and really present their support to Israel. How do you explain this?
We worked really hard to get to this point. It happened, I think, thanks to two major aspects. First is the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For years we explained to the world that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I recall in 2017 that together with Ambassador Nikki Haley, we presented a resolution in the General Assembly condemning Hamas, and we got the majority of the votes. I brought to Israel 100 UN ambassadors, and we went to the south to see the terror tunnels of Hamas, and we walked. And today people understand that we are fighting a vicious terrorist organization. The second part is the sophisticated work of the IDF. We do our best to minimize civilian casualties. We actually call people before we attack a building in Gaza, and I think it allows us more time, more maneuver in terms of diplomacy.
Now, in terms of a ceasefire, just as someone who was really in the United Nations, what does it mean actually? What does it mean when world powers and countries and states call on Israel to have a ceasefire agreement with a terror organization? It's not another state.
So I wouldn't say an agreement, because I don't think you have today negotiations and you have draft resolutions. I think basically there will be an understanding that there will be no missiles and rockets flying into Israel, and there will be no attacks coming from Israel into Gaza, period. So we are not in a position to negotiate with Hamas, and we also have to remember, we have the bodies of Oron Shaul and Adar Goldin. We have 2 Israeli citizens still in Gaza, and we have to speak about them as well.
And do you think that something can happen on that issue? Because we're not seeing the officials talking about them enough.
We have to speak about them. And I think now when you start to hear about humanitarian aid to Gaza, and you hear that from Egypt, Turkey, many European countries, we have to tell them, with all due respect, we have our humanitarian issues. If you want to build Gaza again, start by bringing back the bodies of our boys.
Though, what's very frustrating is that even if there's a ceasefire agreement, then comes one rocket, one missile, and then Israel doesn't know what to do, or we see Israel always, trying to say maybe it's still a ceasefire. What is your opinion on that?
No, I think we should have zero tolerance. And I think if that will happen, we should target the Hamas leaders personally. And I wouldn't advise them to get out of the tunnels so fast. I would advise them to stay where they are, because after what they did to us, putting the lives of millions of Israelis in danger, I think in the future we will be the ones that will start the next round with Gaza. And when the time will come, we will have the advantage of assassinating those leaders.
Now, maybe foreign ministers and state leaders are expressing support, but when you turn on the mainstream media and many channels around the world, it seems that the world, when you look through the media, is against us. How do you look at that war, the PR Hasbara war?
So I'm very active on that front, Yoni. Every night I spend hours explaining our position to all those networks, the hostile one like Al Jazeera, BBC, Sky News, and you have to face lies. And I argue with them. I tell them, how come you accept the narrative of Hamas? It's challenging, but I think when you stick to the facts, you can win that war. And I think we are not losing that war. One point we have to pay attention is the social media. I think we have to do a better job in terms of spreading our side in the social media. That's a crucial aspect in today's PR campaign.
Let's go back to what we started, President Joe Biden. Do you think that as we are seeing support, in addition to the request and demand that maybe we should get to proceed to a ceasefire, do you think that this is a different policy than what we saw in the Obama administration?
I hope so. And I believe it will be different. I think President Biden has his own ideas, his own policies. And I think what we saw in the last few days, the support we received, we should not take it for granted. We should appreciate it. Even though, as I mentioned earlier, the language that was used by Secretary Blinken, by the ambassador to the UN, I didn't appreciate it always.
Speaking about two sides.
There are no two sides to the conflict. You have a terrorist organization and you have the State of Israel. When Al-Qaeda attacked the US in 9/11, nobody spoke about the two sides. So we should remind it to our colleagues in the US, and we should remind it to Congresswoman Cortez and other radical leaders in the Democratic Party that are supporting Hamas, that Hamas is the only organization that actually supported Al-Qaeda back in 9/11, 2001.
Okay, Danny Danon, former ambassador of Israel to the United Nations and chairman of World Likud. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.